Victory often teaches us little, but defeat can offer the most profound lessons. In 1741, the Royal Navy, at the zenith of its power, faced an unexpected and catastrophic setback at Cartagena that wasn't about enemy might, but about their own hubris and fatal miscalculations. This isn't a story of glorious conquest, but of how a devastating failure against a seemingly weaker foe forced an empire to fundamentally rethink its naval doctrine and ultimately forge a stronger, more resilient force. To understand the magnitude of the disaster that awaited the British Empire in the Caribbean, one must first understand the intoxicating atmosphere of London in the late 1730s. The War of Jenkins' Ear had begun, fueled by merchant grievances and jingoistic fervour. In 1739, Admiral Edward Vernon had captured the Spanish colonial port of Portobello with a mere 6 ships. It was a victory so swift, so decisive, and so incredibly easy that it did more than just boost morale. It intoxicated the British public and the Admiralty with a dangerous sense of invincibility. The streets of London rang with bells, and Parliament was eager to authorise a knockout blow against the Spanish Main. The target was Cartagena de Indias, the jewel of the Spanish trade routes, a city where the wealth of the Andes flowed before crossing the Atlantic. The expedition assembled to take Cartagena was not merely a military force, it was a floating city, a statement of imperial inevitability. By the time the fleet gathered in early 1741, it comprised 186 ships. Among them were 29 massive ships of the line, the battleships of their day, bristling with tiers of heavy cannon. Packed into these wooden walls were approximately 30,000 men. There were 15,000 sailors and 12,000 soldiers, including 4,000 American colonists drawn from Virginia and other provinces, eager to prove their worth to the crown. To put this into perspective, this was the largest amphibious operation the world would see until the Allied invasion of Normandy in 1944. It was a juggernaut of oak, canvas and iron, designed not just to defeat the enemy, but to overawe them into immediate submission. The confidence within this armada was absolute. So certain were the British of their coming triumph that the very concept of defeat had been banished from their collective imagination. In a display of premature celebration that historians still cite as the ultimate example of military hubris, artisans in London had already struck commemorative victory medals before the fleet had even fired a shot. These medals circulated through the capital, depicting the Spanish commander kneeling in surrender before the gallant Admiral Vernon. The inscription read, "The Spanish pride pulled down by Admiral Vernon." It was a level of arrogance that bordered on delusion, driven by the assumption that the Spanish defences were antiquated and their fighting spirit non-existent. As this leviathan of a fleet arrived off the coast of present-day Colombia, the sight alone was intended to break the enemy's will. The horizon was cluttered with masts, a forest of timber moving relentlessly toward the shore. From the quarterdeck of his flagship, Admiral Vernon looked out at the city of Cartagena, fully expecting a repetition of his easy success at Portobello. The British command believed they were facing a crumbling empire, manned by demoralized troops who would flee at the first roar of a British broadside. They saw the expedition not as a battle, but as a procession, a collection of spoils to be divided among the victors. However, this ostentatious display of naval might masked deep, systemic rots within the British force. While the ship count was impressive, the coordination was non-existent. The British leadership was walking into a theatre of war they did not understand, against an enemy they had criminally underestimated. They believed that superior numbers and heavier guns were the only metrics that mattered in warfare. They failed to account for the terrain, the climate, or the tenacity of a cornered opponent. The fleet anchored with the pomp and circumstance of a victory parade, oblivious to the fact that they were sailing directly into a meticulously crafted kill zone. They assumed the Spanish were trembling behind their walls. In reality, the Spanish were waiting, watching, and counting the days until the weather would turn the British numbers against themselves. The stage was set not for a coronation, but for a slaughter, born of the fatal assumption that the British Empire was simply too big to fail. Gazing out from the ramparts of Cartagena, watching the horizon fill with British canvas, stood a man who was the antithesis of the polished, aristocratic Admiral Vernon. His name was Admiral Blas de Lezo, a figure known to his men as Medio Hombre, or half-man. It was a grimly affectionate nickname, earned through a lifetime of sacrifice for the Spanish crown. Lezo had lost his left leg to a cannonball in Malaga, his left eye at Toulon, and his right arm at the siege of Barcelona. He was a battered, broken wreck of a body, held together by sheer willpower and strategic genius. While Vernon commanded the largest fleet the Caribbean had ever seen, Lezo commanded a skeleton crew. Against the 30,000 British invaders, he could muster perhaps 3,000 to 6,000 defenders, a ragged mix of Spanish regulars, local militia, and indigenous archers. Against 186 British ships, Lezo possessed only 6. On paper, the battle was already over. But warfare is not played on paper, it is played on terrain. And Lezo understood the terrain of Cartagena better than anyone alive. He knew that the British numbers were their greatest strength, but also their greatest liability. To deploy 30,000 men, one needs space, and Cartagena offered none. The city was not an open target sitting on the coast. It was a fortress tucked deep within a complex network of lagoons and bays, shielded by mangrove swamps and narrow navigational channels. To reach the city proper, the massive British fleet had to squeeze through a choke point known as Boca Chica, or the Little Mouth. This narrow inlet was the only deep-water access to the outer harbour, and it was guarded by the imposing forts of San Luis and San Jose. Lezo's strategy was not to meet the British in a decisive open battle. That would have been suicide. Instead, he designed a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. He turned Cartagena into a deadly gauntlet, a series of locked doors that the British would have to smash down one by one, bleeding for every inch of progress. Across the narrow Boca Chica channel, he strung a massive iron chain boom, physically barring entry to the harbour. Behind this, he positioned his paltry few ships, not to sail out and fight, but to act as floating batteries, adding their gunfire to the fort's crossfire. When the British inevitably pressured these positions, Lezo did the unthinkable. He scuttled his own ships. By sinking his vessels in the shallow channels, he created underwater barricades of timber and iron. This forced the British to stop their advance, lower their boats, and spend days trying to clear the wreckage, all while under constant fire from the shore batteries. Every delay was calculated. Lezo was playing a game of time, weaponizing the calendar itself. He knew what the British commanders, blinded by their arrogance, had chosen to ignore. The sickly season was approaching. In the tropical Caribbean, the arrival of the rains brought with it the proliferation of the Aedes aegypti mosquito, the vector for yellow fever. Lezo knew that a European army, crammed into the unhygienic holds of transport ships, was a ticking biological time bomb. He did not need to kill every British soldier with a musket ball. He simply needed to hold them in the swamps long enough for the fever to do the work for him. The British, confident in their invincible armada, sailed directly into this trap. They saw the forts as mere obstacles to be brushed aside, unaware that the geography was funneling them into kill zones where their superior numbers counted for nothing. A ship of the line with its 100 guns is a terrifying weapon on the open sea, but stuck in a narrow channel, unable to maneuver, it is little more than a stationary target. Lezo used the shallow waters and the prevailing winds to nullify Vernon's firepower. He forced the British to fight on his terms, in a humid, mosquito-infested hellscape where the heat was oppressive and the water was scarce. As the British began their initial bombardments, pounding the outer forts with thousands of cannonballs, they believed they were softening up the enemy. In reality, they were wasting ammunition on stone walls, while their crews began to sweat and sicken in the tropical sun. Lizo, watching from his command post, remained patient. He sacrificed outer defences when necessary, retreating only to draw the British deeper into the lagoon, stretching their supply lines and forcing them to disembark troops into the fever-ridden marshes. The trap was set, the door was locked, and the British were busy trying to kick it down, completely unaware that the house was already burning around them. If the Spanish defences were the anvil upon which the British expedition was to be tested, the British command structure was a hammer made of glass. As the fleet pushed past the scuttled ships at Boca Chica and entered the massive harbour, the operation shifted from a naval bombardment to a joint amphibious assault. It was precisely at this juncture, where cooperation was paramount, that the expedition began to disintegrate from the top down. The British forces were led by two men who did not merely disagree on strategy, they seemed to inhabit entirely different realities. Admiral Vernon, the naval commander, was aggressive, blustery, and utterly contemptuous of the land forces. General Thomas Wentworth, commanding the army, was indecisive, inexperienced, and paralyzed by a fear of failure. Their relationship was toxic to the point of absurdity. Despite their flagships often being anchored within sight of one another, the two commanders refused to meet in person to coordinate the battle. Instead, they waged a petty war of correspondence, exchanging vitriolic letters that dripped with sarcasm and blame, while thousands of men waited for orders. Vernon demanded that the army storm the fortifications immediately, accusing the soldiers of cowardice. Wentworth, stinging from the insults, dug in his heels, refusing to move until the navy obliterated every Spanish gun. This deadlock created a fatal paralysis. While the commanders bickered over protocol and prestige, the army sat idle in the sweltering heat, and Blaster Lazo's biological clock kept ticking. The tragedy of this dysfunction culminated in the assault on San Felipe de Barajas, the massive fortress dominating the approach to the city. After weeks of dithering, Wentworth finally ordered a night attack. It was a desperate move, conceived in haste and executed without the necessary artillery support because Vernon, in a fit of pique, refused to bring his heavy ships close enough to silence the Spanish batteries. The infantry, including the American Colonial Regiment, marched into the darkness, guided by Spanish deserters whose loyalty was dubious at best. What followed was a masterclass in tactical ineptitude. The guides led the British columns astray, bringing them to the steepest, most heavily defended face of the fortress. As the sun began to rise, exposing the troops to withering fire from the ramparts, the British engineers rushed forward to place their scaling ladders. It was here that the campaign suffered its most humiliating and heartbreaking moment. As the ladders were hoisted against the stone walls, a collective gasp of horror rippled through the ranks. The ladders were too short. The British intelligence had failed to account for a simple, brutal countermeasure. The Spanish had dug a deep trench at the base of the fortress walls, effectively increasing their height by several feet. The soldiers, laden with heavy muskets and equipment, found themselves stranded at the bottom of the ramparts, staring up at the unattainable parapets. They were sitting ducks. Spanish defenders rained down musketry and grenades upon the confused mass of redcoats. There was no plan B, no retreat cover, and no naval bombardment to suppress the enemy. It was a slaughter of helpless men, dictated not by the enemy's superior skill, but by a failure of basic measurement and planning. While the army bled out against the walls of San Felipe, a quieter, more terrifying death was consuming the fleet. The logistics of the expedition had collapsed. The fresh water supplies, stored in wooden casks, had gone brackish or run dry. But the greatest error was a decision born of stubbornness and ignorance. Rather than establishing camps on the open, breezy shores, where sanitation could be managed, the command kept the vast majority of the troops packed aboard the transport ships. These vessels became floating pest houses. Thousands of men were crammed into the stifling, sun-baked holds, rocking in the gentle swell of the lagoon. The air grew heavy with the stench of unwashed bodies and excrement. In these incubating chambers, yellow fever exploded with terrifying virulence. It moved from ship to ship, unseen and unstoppable. Men who had been healthy in the morning were delirious with high fevers by noon, vomiting black bile, the dreaded vomito negro, and dead by sunset. The discord between Vernon and Wentworth meant that even the sick were neglected, as neither commander wanted to take responsibility for the deteriorating condition of the force. The invincible armada was effectively rotting from the inside out, paralyzed by the egos of two men who were too busy fighting each other to fight the enemy. By early May 1741, the rains that Blastelezo had predicted arrived with torrential fury, turning the British encampments into quagmires and sealing the fate of the expedition. The invincible armada had been reduced to a collection of rotting hulks, drifting in a harbour that had become a necropolis. The order to retreat, when it finally came, was not a strategic withdrawal, but an admission of total catastrophe. The siege was lifted, the guns were spiked, and the battered remnants of the army were ferried back to the ships, leaving behind the smoking ruins of their failed assaults and the shallow graves of their comrades. The scenes inside the harbour during those final days were apocalyptic. The death rate from yellow fever and dysentery had climbed so high that the living could barely keep up with the dead. Funeral services were abandoned, bodies were simply sewn into hammocks and slid overboard. The waters around the British fleet, once teeming with longboats and activity, now churned with sharks, drawn in by the ceaseless disposal of corpses. It was a grisly, churning assembly line of death that haunted the survivors for the rest of their days. The proud force that had sailed from England to conquer the Spanish Main was dissolving into the dark waters of the Caribbean, defeated not by the cannon of the enemy, but by the microscopic tyranny of the mosquito and the monumental incompetence of their own leaders. The human cost of the Cartagena expedition was staggering, a demographic black hole that swallowed a generation of sailors and soldiers. Of the nearly 30,000 men who arrived at Cartagena, estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 18,000 perished. What makes this figure truly horrifying is the ratio of the dead. Only a small fraction died from Spanish muskets or cannon fire. The vast majority, perhaps as many as 90% of the casualties, succumbed to disease. The American regiment, the Gooch's Marines, suffered appalling losses. Of the 3,600 colonists who had volunteered, eager to serve the mother country, only about 300 returned home. Among the survivors was a young Virginian officer named Lawrence Washington. He would return to his family estate, broken in health but wiser in the ways of war, and name his plantation Mount Vernon, in honor of the admiral he still admired, unwittingly immortalizing the architect of the disaster. When the shattered remains of the fleet finally limped back to Jamaica and eventually to England, the news of the debacle crashed into London society with the force of a tidal wave. The mood in the capital shifted overnight, from jingoistic euphoria to bitter, incredulous rage. The victory medals that had been struck months prior, depicting the Spanish commander kneeling in submission, suddenly became objects of intense national shame. Merchants and citizens who had bought them as souvenirs now hid them away or melted them down, desperate to erase the physical evidence of their collective delusion. The premature celebration became a punchline, a bitter symbol of the dangers of counting one's chickens before the fortress is stormed. The political fallout was immediate and severe. The defeat at Cartagena did not just bruise the national ego, it toppled the government. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who had reluctantly agreed to the war under public pressure, found his administration unable to withstand the storm of criticism. The disaster provided the ammunition his political enemies needed, and his long-standing government crumbled. Meanwhile, the architects of the failure, Vernon and Wentworth, engaged in a public and pathetic war of words. Upon their return, they did not face a firing squad, but they did face the court of public opinion. They spent years publishing pamphlets, leaking private correspondence and writing editorials, each desperately trying to pin the blame on the other. Vernon blamed the Army's sloth, Wentworth blamed the Navy's arrogance. But beyond the scapegoating, a harsh reality settled over the British military establishment. The illusion of effortless supremacy was shattered. Cartagena proved that the Royal Navy, for all its majesty and firepower, was not an omnipotent magic wand that could be waved at a map to secure victory. The disaster exposed the fatal flaw in British power projection, the disconnect between land and sea. It demonstrated that a fleet could control the waves, but without a competent, healthy, and well-led army to secure the shore, naval dominance was meaningless against a fortified enemy. The Empire had learned, at the cost of nearly 20,000 lives, that hubris is the most dangerous enemy of all, and that in the unforgiving theatre of war, nature always bats last. In the annals of military history, victories are celebrated, but disasters are studied. As the shock of Cartagena faded, replaced by the grim determination of a nation at war, the Royal Navy and the British Army began the painful process of introspection. The failure was too absolute, the loss of life too grotesque to simply be dismissed as bad luck. The catastrophe at Cartagena de Indias forced a fundamental reckoning within the British military establishment, initiating a transformation that would eventually turn the stumbling giant of 1741 into the professional, conquering machine of the late 18th and 19th centuries. The ruins of the expedition became the foundation for a new doctrine of amphibious warfare. The most immediate and critical lesson was the necessity of unity of command. The toxic, bifurcated leadership of Vernon and Wentworth had proven that a fleet and an army operating as rival fiefdoms was a recipe for disaster. The British realized that in amphibious operations, the boundary between land and sea is fluid. Ships must support troops, and troops must secure harbours for ships. This realization did not fix inter-service rivalries overnight, but it planted the seed for the concept of joint operations. In the decades that followed, commanders were selected not just for their individual brilliance, but for their ability to cooperate. The days of an admiral and a general refusing to speak to one another while the campaign collapsed around them were, slowly but surely, coming to an end. Furthermore, the sickly season ceased to be treated as a mere inconvenience and was elevated to a primary strategic consideration. The Admiralty began to understand that logistics and hygiene were as lethal as cannon fire. It is no coincidence that just 6 years after the Cartagena debacle, Scottish naval surgeon James Lind conducted his famous experiments aboard the HMS Salisbury, proving that citrus fruit could cure scurvy. While the acceptance of these medical advances was slow, the horror of Cartagena, where men died in their thousands from preventable causes, accelerated the push for better victualling, ventilation, and sanitation aboard His Majesty's ships. The Empire learned that to project power globally, it first had to keep its sailors alive. The proof of this painful education arrived during the 7 Years' War, less than 2 decades later. In 1762, the British launched another massive amphibious assault against a major Spanish stronghold in the Caribbean, Havana. On the surface, the operation looked dangerously similar to Cartagena, but this time, the execution was radically different. The British arrived with a unified command structure, better maps, and a keen awareness of the clock. They struck with speed and coordination, utilizing the Navy to aggressively suppress shore batteries, while the infantry maneuvered with precise support. They captured Havana before the tropical diseases could liquidate the force. The victory at Havana was the redemption of Cartagena, a masterclass in amphibious warfare that was directly informed by the errors of 1741. The British had learned that hubris kills, but preparation conquers. Yet, the legacy of Cartagena echoes in a place far removed from the warm waters of the Caribbean. Lawrence Washington, the Virginian officer who survived the fever-ridden hell of the expedition, returned to the colony of Virginia a changed man. Despite the defeat, he retained a deep, complicated respect for Admiral Vernon, perhaps admiring the Admiral's aggressive spirit, if not his cooperative skills. When Lawrence built his plantation home on the banks of the Potomac River, he named it Mount Vernon. Upon Lawrence's untimely death, likely hastened by the tuberculosis he contracted during the campaign, the estate passed to his younger half-brother, George. Thus, the home of the first American president, the cradle of the American Revolution, bears the name of the British admiral who led the empire's greatest disaster. It is a strange historical irony that serves as a fitting epitaph for the campaign. The Battle of Cartagena de Indias was a tragedy of errors, a monument to arrogance, and a graveyard for thousands. But in the long arc of history, it served a vital purpose. It shattered the illusion of easy victory and forced a modernization of military thought that would shape the world for centuries to come. The British Empire walked into the fires of Cartagena and was burned, but the steel that emerged was harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. Defeat, as it turned out, was the ultimate teacher. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most catastrophic naval blunders, please leave a like and let us know in the comments. Do you think Admiral Vernon or General Wentworth was more to blame for the disaster? We're releasing new military history documentaries every week, uncovering the forgotten battles and strategic turning points that shaped our world. So, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a briefing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next battlefield.